这一次的采访最重要的几个问题。
没关系。
非线性的叙事，看不懂，不接地气。他对于新技术在电影中的应用是一个怎么样的一个态度？他一方面在尝试一些新鲜的一些拍摄的方法，比如说 IMAX 的那个拍摄，但是他对于数码拍摄方式非常抗拒。还有很重要的一点，诺兰在拍这部《敦刻尔克》的时候，这种战争题材的电影的时候，应该怎样去表现出这种爱国主义的热情，但同时又不必去刺激或者煽动这种民族主义情绪？他是怎样去做到这种平衡，或者是克制自己的？来了。
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Hello, very nice to meet you.
As far as I know, you have never filmed historical movies or war movies. Why did you choose Dunkirk evacuation, this real historical event? I mean, is this because you have some personal attachment to this piece of history, or you just want to try something new?
Well, for me, as for most British people, Dunkirk's a very well-known story. I mean, we grow up with this story. And for British people, it's part of the culture. They talk about the Dunkirk spirit. You know, it's an incredibly important event. The reason for that is it's just an incredible story. And as a filmmaker, you're looking for gaps in the cultural record, if you like. You're looking for things that you can bring to an audience that haven't been done before. And for some reason, and I don't really know why, the Dunkirk story had never been told in modern cinema. But it's a simple story, and it's a very dramatic story that has worked its way into Hollywood and Hollywood culture. You know, there are many Dunkirk moments in Hollywood films, but they don't acknowledge the source. The source is this incredible story from World War II, whereby you have the entire British Army, 400,000 men on a beach at Dunkirk, the enemy closing in on all sides, and they're close enough to home that they can see it. On a clear day, you can see right across the channel, but they can't get there. So it's this race against time and this choice that they face between surrender and annihilation. And the fact that the story doesn't end in surrender or annihilation is one of the reasons I think it's one of the greatest stories in human history. So it's a huge opportunity for me as a filmmaker to be able to bring this to an international audience.
But I'm thinking it must be quite challenging to film such movies. You know, on the one hand, you have to build up an epic picture of the war. On the other hand, you need to touch the audience hearts with an intimate story. So how did you balance between the two?
I wanted to make what I refer to as an intimate epic. Dunkirk is the biggest story I know. I mean, it involves hundreds of thousands of men. It involves boats, planes. You know, it's on a colossal scale. But I felt like the only way to make it a vital and vibrant experience for an audience who has seen many, many large war films over the years, to me, the only way to really do that was subjectivity. It was to really give you an experience, to have you sitting there in a movie theatre, hopefully with a giant screen, you know, and just have you there on that beach, and have you there in that cockpit of a Spitfire, you know, dogfighting the enemy, have you on the decks of a small boat, a civilian vessel coming over to help with the evacuation, really put you there. That intimacy, that subjectivity was to me the way into the film. I didn't view it as a war film. I viewed it as a survival story. I wanted you to just be there caring about these characters just because of the situation they're in, not because of a lot of talk about who they are or where they've come from, but really because they're in this terrible situation. You wouldn't want to be there yourself, and create suspense that way.
You know, history, I think, is often a combination of real events and maybe narratives by different sources. So your movie is very important for the people to understand the war and the history. But my question is, what special contribution do you think this film will make compared with other existing historical materials and literary works?
Well, I think the contribution that it can make, and what cinema is best at doing, is bringing historical information to life and making it accessible in a a visceral sense. And that's really, I think, as I think about it, it's really why I wanted to make it in such a subjective way, because I wasn't too self-conscious about this, but now that we talk about it, I think that that's what I felt confident bringing. There's a huge responsibility with dealing with a real-life historical event, and I didn't want to interpret it politically. I didn't want to interpret it historically even. What I wanted to do, and what I felt a movie could do, is to make it come to life for people, is to make them feel the suspense and the fear and the intensity of the situation and the emotion of the situation. That's what movies are best at, I think. And that's what the movie, in a sense, tries to confine itself to being. You know, we don't show generals in rooms or politicians, or, you know, we're there with the soldiers on the beach. We're really trying to make this an intense experience for the audience.
Well, generally speaking, what do you want to tell the audience by this movie? I mean, in your movies, there are always some, like the philosophical or moral issues being tackled, and even very abstract construction of time and space. So this time, what's the message you want to convey, the key message?
Well, I think the experience of the film, hopefully, there's a sense of cumulative emotion and appreciation by the end of the film for what we can achieve as a community. It's really, for me, what Dunkirk and Dunkirk Spirit is. It's about, as individuals, we're flawed, we have selfish desires. It's a survival story in which you're seeing people wrestle with that conflict of the selfishness versus, you know, trying to do the right thing in a way. But what you feel by the end, hopefully, is a sense of we are empowered by each other, we need each other. As a community, we can achieve much more than we can achieve as individuals.
A big question, what's your understanding of wars, and how do you think this movie can help us to rethink the wars and rethink our history and future?
I think the film tries not to have a specific position on warfare other than an experiential one. That is to say, we deal with the trivial issues. We deal with how do you eat, how do you sleep, is there enough water, you know, what are these guys, what's it like to really be there, suffering horrible intensity and fear, and then long stretches of boredom. What's the physical, practical reality of that? And if we can create some sense of that, of what it would be like to experience these things, hopefully that makes people think about war in slightly more human terms, rather than, there is a tendency to think of war as a philosophical abstraction, as either nobility or necessary evil or whatever, you know. In this film, we're trying to deal with it in very human terms. What does it feel like? What would it feel like to be there? And the answer to that inevitably is you know, it's, you know, not someplace you want to be and not something you want to be a part of if you can possibly avoid it. But that's not the same thing as having a specifically anti-war message, for example.
In peacetime, some war or action movies may lead to rational reflection, but some may incite nationalist sentiments. So my question is, how do you think of your responsibility to avoid the extreme nationalism when you're making the war movies like Dunkirk?
Well, I think that there are various issues at play there. It's a complicated question. The responsibility is to be truthful. The responsibility is to be true to the historical accuracy and the spirit of the thing, and be true to what you see as the positive attributes of it. And so, certainly in English terms, you don't want to necessarily confuse patriotism with nationalism. It's not the same thing. And one of the things that I think is important in discussions of this type is for people to understand that you can't give the concept of patriotism to one political side or another. It's not appropriate. Patriotism is apolitical. Patriotism is about love of country, it's about love of community. Yes. And Dunkirk is a story about community. It's a story about togetherness. It's a very, very positive story. And anybody who tries to appropriate that for a specific contemporary political message is being dishonest, because the reality is it happened, it's real, it happened in 1940. And what we're making we're trying as far as possible to be faithful to the spirit of those real events. And so the film should therefore not be subject to specific contemporary interpretations.
You have said that Dunkirk is your most experimental movie since Memento. In addition to the unprecedented choice of a historical theme, are there any new attempts at shooting techniques or technologies in this movie?
Well, there's quite a considerable advancement in terms of our ability to shoot with the IMAX format, the large film format. The entire film for the first time is shot on large format film. So even the dialogue scenes we shot on 65mm film. So the entire film is large format film and analog color. And we did an entirely analog post-production process, which we've never been able to do before. And so what that presents is a very, very heightened sense of reality visually to the film. The color is analog color. It's a better color representation of the way the eye sees. And so hopefully there's a sense of reality and immediacy that we haven't been able to achieve before.
There are few lines in this movie, but the background music, the ticking clock in particular, is always running. Why?
I wanted to really try and tell the story in very visual terms, and I wanted a constant reminder that time is the enemy in this film. This is a race against time, and I wanted to create a sense of continuous acceleration and continuous suspense, relentless suspense. It's one of the reasons that the film is quite short. It's just over an hour and a half, 107 minutes, and it's shorter than my other films. People were a bit surprised by that when they knew that, it's a big film, a historical epic or whatever, and usually those are 3-hour films, whatever. I really wanted the experience to be very intense and obviously so, and relentless. And so you don't want to exhaust the audience too much. There's a sort of a sweet spot for what the length of that should be.
So from the choice of the subject to the shooting techniques, actually you are trying new things constantly. But why do you insist on film shooting instead of digital cinema?
Well, the thing about photochemical film is it has higher resolution than video formats, and it has better color representation. So if you're looking to make a film that looks realistic, as it were, looks the way the eye sees the world, photochemical film is the best analogy for the way the eye sees that's ever been invented. And so for that reason, it's a very important medium to maintain and to use. I think digital is very good for heightened reality. It's very good for a particular stylization, particularly for animated films and so forth, with films with very bright colors and so forth. It lends itself to that. But I think if you want to make a film that retains the anomalies of how the eye sees the world and the subtleties of that, film is the way to go.
Are you disappointed for the decline of the traditional films? I mean, the film shooting.
Oh, very much, yeah. No, I think that there have been a lot of economic reasons, a lot of industrial reasons for why photochemical film has been devalued. And I think it's not a good thing at all. There are great benefits to certain aspects of digital distribution, particularly in terms of consistency of quality, which on film is hard to maintain. But a well-projected film print is still the best way to see any film, and I think it's important for filmmakers in the world of film to acknowledge that and maintain that to a degree.
But do you think that maybe one day the film shooting, the traditional film, will probably bounce back to the market as a mainstream again?
I think very likely. I think it's already happening. You see a lot of filmmakers wanting to use it now. The more familiar people are with the digital imitation of photochemical imaging, the more they start to value the difference. It's not unlike, in the consumer world, the rise of vinyl, for example. I don't know if it's big in China or not, but Sony, for example, in Japan, they just started pressing vinyl records again because there's a huge demand for them now. Because over time, our ears have adjusted, and just as with film, your eyes adjust to understand the difference between an analog format and digital format. I think in the early days of the digital revolution in cinema, there was an assumption that I think even I shared, that eventually digital technology would assume the same characteristics of film as it got higher resolution, etc., etc. I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I think it's always going to look different.
Yes.
It's just a different medium, and that's fine. And it's great for some things. There are filmmakers who love it, and they're able to use it, and that's terrific, and I would fight for their right to be able to use it. But I don't want filmmakers who want to use film unable to use it. I think it's very important that it has its place, you know, in our industry.
But I'm curious that if Hollywood investors ever try to persuade you to shift to the digital shooting, you know, that means more profits, more money for them.
Well, in the early days, there was a strong push, and then what you looked at is that there are no savings to be had. Films aren't any cheaper than they were pre-digital era. We make our films. We made this film cheaper than anyone else in Hollywood would have made it, and we did it on IMAX film format. The reality is, what you're paying for in a film like Dunkirk, you have, you know, we rebuilt a section of the mole out into the water at Dunkirk on location. We hired thousands of extras. We had planes, we had boats, we had a massive crew for months and months and months filming. That's where your money goes. And so the idea that you use a cheaper camera or something, that's an economically viable solution to controlling costs, it's absurd, you know.
I understand. Well, from my point, there's always a conflict between the business and art in filmmaking industry. Did you feel that, you know, some of your initial idealistic beliefs for filmmaking have gradually bent to the commercial market and capital demands over the past 20 years? And for example, have you ever compromised when negotiating with investors?
I think I've been very fortunate in that the early success of my films gave me a little bit of freedom, a little bit of insulation. That is to say, I've had a lot of trust from Warner Brothers, the studio I've worked with the most over the years. And so I've really been able to make the films the way I want to make them. But I've always tried to do that with a realistic head on. It's not, to me, about compromise. It's about making the film, I call it a register, like a register of language. It's like if I'm making a film for hundreds of millions of dollars, it's about, you know, Batman or whatever, I have as an audience member, I have a particular expectation what the film's going to be. As a filmmaker, I like to challenge that expectation, but not entirely, I don't want to ignore it. And so I think that, for me, is the important thing. It's like you want to make the film that you would want to see as a filmgoer, but you have to be honest with yourself about what am I looking for from that movie experience. That's been my guiding principle, and I've been very lucky and very fortunate, and I've chosen to work with the right people, and I've been able to have a lot of autonomy, a lot of creative freedom, whilst working with large budgets, and you know, that's a great privilege.
Yeah, maybe you are an exception because you have proved that you can make a lot of money for the investors in your own ways. But viewed from the overall trend of the world movie industry, it seems quite clear that, you know, the power of the capital and technology is getting bigger and bigger, but the director is not so important as before. Do you share this feeling?
Well, yes, but I think that it's artificial. What the industry values is the predictability of IP, predictability of established franchises. They want to be able to tell their investors, we will have these 2 films for this year and these 2 films for the year after. And that flies in the face of history, of movie history. I think it's a brief anomaly. Filmmaking is a very, very unpredictable business. It's a very difficult business to invest in truth. And you've always had massive success from the most unexpected quarters. And you've always had massive failure from things that people assume will be successful. And so over time, you will always see that volatility in a creative industry. There's no way around it. And so I think that there's a bit of an artificial situation right now whereby investors are convinced that by using established IP as the creative backbone of a slate, that you can have a very predictable set of returns. Over time, that will be disproven. I'm very confident of that, because if you look at 100 years of film history, it's not really how movies work, and filmmakers always have a very important part in bringing new ideas to the table, because the one thing that Hollywood doesn't forget, or forgets at its own peril, the studios would forget at their own peril, is novelty. You know, audiences want something new. They don't necessarily want to know what every film next summer is going to be and every film the summer after that. They might want some of that, but they also want the surprise. They want something that comes out of left field and shows them something they've never seen before.
You know, technology and capital are merely tools, and only directors can create the movies in their own ways, just like you. Well, you are most famous in your non-linear and multi-clue narrative approach. I was wondering, why are you so fascinated about it?
Well, I think that cinema, any movie, has an interesting relationship with the audience's understanding of time. And so if you think about any conventional film that you go see, your understanding of the time that the characters are passing through, the time of the story, is manipulated in a very interesting way by the very medium of cinema. And so what I've tried to do in all the films I've made is be very conscious of that. And at times to take that mechanism from the background and make it very much the foreground and involve the viewer in understanding how their sense of time is being manipulated. Usually for me, it's about what's the point of view of the story. So in the case of Dunkirk, it's very much about reminding the audience or empowering the audience, their understanding of that they're trapped in that cockpit of the Spitfire with the pilot who's running out of fuel, who's desperately trying to help the people down below. Or they're trapped on that beach for a longer period of time, suffering bombardment, but also boredom. So for me, the manipulation of time and the self-consciousness of that, or involving the audience's consciousness in that, is really about having another tool that I think the medium of cinema is very efficient at, is very good at.
Well, to be frank, some of the audience, or maybe some of the fans even, they have different views on this, I mean, on your narrative approach. They argue that too much emphasis on the narrative techniques will probably compromise the delivery of the key message and the audience reception. And that's maybe one of the reasons why a lot of people say that they fail to get a movie. So how do you respond to such sayings?
Well, I think that self-consciousness is an impossible thing to legislate. It's unique to each individual. And I have found right from the first films I made, from Following and Memento particularly, people who, as they watched the film, tried to understand the structure and engage with the structure, did not get the film. They didn't understand the film. People who sat back and let it wash over them understood the film. Because the structure, the difficulty with an unconventional structure that draws attention to itself is that it invites analysis, and that takes you out of the movie. But the way these structures are intended to work is you're intended to allow that to wash over you and have some more subliminal effect in terms of your alignment with the emotional attitude of a character. So in the case of Memento, you have a character who can't remember what's just happened. So by withholding that information from the audience, by inverting the chronology, we try to align you and make you sympathetic to that character. But if you puzzle over it too much, then you miss the experience. And so, yes, the risk with a more unconventional structure is that not everybody is able to go along for that ride, in a sense. But I think that I have certainly felt that there is a larger number of people able to go along for that ride than perhaps the studio or critics always think. And I think I've always been struck by my inability to predict which members of the audience will be able to sort of engage with the experience the way I think they should, or the way I've intended, I should say, and which aren't.
How to define a good movie?
I think for me, quality in films is all about the sincerity of the filmmakers. And so I want to go see a film where the person who made that film honestly believes that what they've done has made the best movie that's ever been made. And I might not agree with that, but that's the quality I want to feel from the filmmaker, that they love what they've done. I don't ever want to go see a film. I hate seeing films where I feel like the filmmaker doesn't believe in it, but they think that maybe I'll like it. You know what I mean? And so I try to only make films. I try to only make films that I really love, that I would really want to go and see. You know, so I suppose you'd call that sincerity.
Okay, let's talk something about China. You know, which Chinese movies have you watched?
I'm quite a fan of Zhang Yimou, and when I was a student, well, Emma, my wife and the producer, we saw Judo, excuse my pronunciation, but I was very struck by the beauty of the filmmaking, in particular the use of colour. I thought was really, really magnificent, and that's stuck with me. But I haven't had the chance to catch up on much. I'd like to see that, but I really haven't had a chance to engage with actually many films at all. When I'm working, I tend not to watch films. Now that I'm finished, I'll go back and you know, see what's come out in the last couple of years.
Well, if you were to film a Chinese movie, what subject would you choose?
That would be a very difficult question for me to answer. I'd have to think long and hard about that, so I don't think I could answer that today.
So, any advice?
Any suggestions?
Okay. Any advice for the Chinese young directors?
Well, I think for me, as a young director starting out, what was important in retrospect, when I look back at it, was to, well, as we say in English, to stick to my guns. What that means really is have a point of view that you can bring to the table that isn't necessarily the same as everybody else's, and stick with that and try and fight for that. Because there are lots of filmmakers who can do films that already exist. So if you're going to distinguish yourself, it's those things that are a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult about what you do that could be of value.
I see. Well, I was told that I can ask the final question, the last question, right? Well, okay. If you were to migrate to the space and you were only allowed to take 3 things, what would you bring?
If I went where?
Migrate to the space.
Oh, migrate. Well, I definitely want to take some oxygen. You mean cultural objects or artifacts?
Up to you.
Gosh, that's a very difficult question to answer. I would certainly want to take some music, and I would want to take books, and I would definitely want to take, if I were on my own, I would need photographs of my family.
Music, books, and family photograph.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.